Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the MyHR Genius Thompson Co. MyHR Best Practices webinar series. I am excited to present to you this month, May 2021, if you're watching a recording of it. So this month we're going to talk about safety in the workplace. We're going to talk a lot about OSHA, and we're going to talk a lot about COVID because are any of us actually doing anything other than talking kind of about COVID all the time and return to work and things like that? Probably if it's not 100% of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, it's probably a pretty significant portion of your day and getting up to speed on COVID and all of the effects of it. So we are definitely going to have a COVID flavor to the presentation today, but we are also going to talk about substantive issues with regard to workplace safety. So this month, so you want to know about about safety in the workplace. This is our 2021 is our So You Want to Know theme series for the year. Every year I try to do something thematic, and this year I came up with So You Want to Know about fill in the blank. So anyway, if you want to watch any of the previous ones or the future ones that you can't make, you are welcome to go to the MyHR Genius website at myhrgenius.co, where we post them, and you can watch them. This is me, and I was told recently by somebody that this picture is awful. So fortunately, my conceit was not threatened, but I should maybe get a new picture. If you are not familiar with the MyHR Genius program, it is a monthly subscription-based program, and we would love to have you as a member. It is we don't price it based on the size of your company. So all companies or nonprofits are at $79 a month to start, and you can ask me or other people on the labor employment team at Thompson Co. You can email or call us with as many questions as you have. It's just $79 bucks a month, and then there's other tiers if you want additional discounted legal services. I think it's a pretty amazing deal for what you get, especially if you have at least one or two HR legal type need help strategically, need to fire somebody types of questions, and you want to bounce something off a lawyer and not have to worry about the bill other than the $79 a month. So you get a lot with it, including webinars and tips of the week. A lot of the tips have been on COVID and COVID-related matters. So the tips go out just to members, and obviously webinar invites and access to the hotline. So if anybody's interested, you can check out our website at myhrgenius.co, or you can always call any of our offices, but you can call me directly at any time at 651-389-5007. Okay, so on to the program. We are going to talk about safety in the workplace. And look, there's a lot with OSHA, and I know, HR obviously has, whether you're general counsel or your HR, your insurance adjuster, I mean, safety is something that we all touch on. And, there depending on the company, you might have a safety director or risk director, somebody like that really oversees a lot of the detailed stuff, especially if it's manufacturing and there's just a lot to have, a lot to do with hazards and PPE and stuff like that. But it is really important for HR to have, and for general counsel and, insurance adjusters, everybody, to really have an understanding of what are the obligations. Like, what ultimately does a company need to understand about safety in the workplace? And the other thing is, I think we've gotten, if you're in human resources and you don't have any real concept of or any exposure to safety issues like OSHA, COVID has taught us all a lesson that is something that we all need to be familiar with. COVID, there's been so much concern about these OSHA issues with COVID and the implementation and how does that work. HR professionals have had to become real subject matter experts on this. And I guess what I would say is, when COVID first came out, like a little over a year ago, kind of hit the scene in March of 2020. Seems like a million years ago, but it wasn't. It was 14 months ago. And when it hit the scene, I did a number of podcasts, and also you can listen to my podcast series on the mychairgenius.co website as well. It's riveting, I guarantee. And we've done a lot of COVID-related, vaccine-related, podcasts and the like. And really not a lot has changed. And I don't, I'm sure you've heard from consultants and lawyers like, oh, the world, COVID's changed the world. Not really. Not from a core rules perspective. The government really never, obviously there's been a lot of guidance from the CDC, and there's been rules all over the place on how we should return to work and what the workplace should look like. And there's a lot of executive orders saying you have to wear masks, and if you don't have your own private office, you should wear a mask, or you have to wear a mask, and you have to wear it in public places, all those things. But the core law itself that is that drives whether, what the risk is in the workplace of having people during a pandemic work around one another, none of that's changed. OSHA, if you take a look at the 300A log reports that a lot of you are probably very familiar with and probably complete for your company, those haven't been changed since 2004. It's not like there was a 2020 update that said, fill in this 300A if in the event of a COVID exposure. The core law regarding safety in the workplace, a core employer responsibility, has been in place the entire time. And again, if you go and listen to my podcast from March of 2020, that's basically what I said, and said with regard to what an employer's responsibility is, and none of it's changed. And it was entirely true the entire time during the pandemic, and it continues to be true today going forward. So whether it's COVID today or SARS years ago, or I guess COVID is technically a SARS disease, or if it's the next pandemic that might come, next month or next year or next decade, it's likely to be we're likely to be applying these same workplace safety rules and the framework. And so this is a very timely webinar, and this should be timely information, but this is also the same sort of information that I could have delivered to you probably 10 years ago, and it would have, without change, and it would still have the same application today. And unless the government changes things drastically 10 years from now, these same principles will likely still drive how we respond to pandemics and other hazards potentially in the workplace. And I will say, in case I forget, COVID's not a hazard, which is one of the reasons why OSHA really doesn't directly apply, because OSHA hasn't determined that COVID itself is a hazard like other hazards. And again, we'll talk about how we identify hazards in the workplace. The only other thing I should say, as I skipped quickly past my photo before we dig into the nuts and bolts, my name's Kevin Mosher. I'm a certified specialist, labor and employment. If you've never listened to this series before, welcome. I've been doing it since 2012, and we do it every month. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to type them on the right side of the in your chat box. And if I see them, if I didn't already cover it, I will try to address your questions. So I do appreciate it. If you raise your hand or something like that, that doesn't do me a whole lot of good. The only communication I can really see is if you write something in the chat box. Okay, so thank you. And again, thank you for your attendance. Okay, so let's talk about having a baseline understanding of of OSHA and workplace safety rules. Okay, so here are, and I certainly don't want to minimize what OSHA brings, but what I'm saying is COVID did not change workplace safety requirements. COVID is just the newest potential hazard concern that employers need to watch out for. No different than vapors and mold and other sorts of safety hazards. Now, there is some difference in that executive orders, we don't have that I know of any executive orders telling you how to deal with mold in the building. Now, you might have some like cleanup requirements and stuff like that, but there's not like you're not going on CNN and finding out about like, oh, this state's dealing with mold. Obviously COVID's been different. It's been much more high profile. It's been much more deadly. But the ultimately, the states came in and said, well, this is how you have to deal with, employees in the workplace. Okay, but that's because a lot of governors made executive orders on this using their emergency powers, and those things are going away. I mean, a lot of states in the last week alone, things are moving fast, right? Since the CDC changed their guidelines a week ago, things are moving very fast, and a lot of governors have rescinded those executive orders. So we're really right back to the beginning, where we were before the executive orders, with the same sort of requirement that first bullet point: employers have to provide a safe workplace. That's it. That's the core baseline. That's been the same core baseline for decades. Now, you have to provide a safe workplace, and everything flows from that. What is a safe workplace? Well, it has to be free of known health and safety hazards. So your obligation as an employer, if you're going to have employees, maybe this is one reason why you need to have employees like not come in ever again, right? And just have them all work remotely. But you have to make sure that if you have a known health or safety hazard, that you address it, that you remedy it, and that you don't, force employees or have employees working under those conditions even while you're waiting for it to be remedied, right? If this is obvious, but I'll say it because it applies to any sort of known safety hazard. If you have, a harness that doesn't seem to be working, or there's a manufacturer recall on some sort of PPE, and that it could potentially leak vapors or something like that, or it could break and the person could fall and hurt themselves. Well, that's a known hazard, and you wouldn't be like, you know what, we're getting new harnesses tomorrow, but for today, just go ahead and climb that tower. Don't go beyond 100 feet because we don't want you to completely die. If the harness breaks, we'll just take a little bit of a risk. So just go up to 100 feet, and if you fall, you'll probably just be in a cast for the rest of your life. That sort of thing, right? We don't do that. So if you have a known hazard, you have to you have an affirmative obligation not to let employees work with that hazard, and you have an obligation to obviously avoid it and then remedy it before you have employees work again. And again, this is why we are worried about COVID and the return to work, because to some extent we know about COVID, right? But again, like I'm telling you, OSHA hasn't determined that COVID is a safety hazard, so that's why we can return people to work. Because even though COVID is out there, even though the flu comes around seasonally, even though even though that working outside might give people skin cancer if they work and they don't put sunscreen on, right? How is that any different than telling people to take care of themselves by putting a mask on? It's similar, right? And again, caveats as there are some executive orders requiring certain things, but just like you would never think, like on a construction site, you wouldn't say, you know what, I absolutely need you to put your sunscreen on because you could get cancer. Yeah, that could happen, but sunlight's not a hazard, right? So OSHA hasn't determined that sunlight's a hazard like a safety harness when people are climbing might be, like other sorts of known hazards like mold and vapor leaks and stuff like that. I keep using those as examples. So along the lines of the safety, the harness have to maintain tools and PPE. Kind of already talked about that. You have to provide safety training as needed. So if there's training that needs to be done, you should have a protocol where safety training is given to new employees at the time of hire. It should be part of the orientation by like your safety director or whoever is going to do the training, or maybe it's less formal training by just the manager, but some sort of safety protocol needs to be in place where the person signs off on, like if it's a safety-sensitive sort of job, like wearing harnesses or something like that, you're going to need those. You're going to want those employees to sign off that they received safety training. It helps you with from a position of liability. For example, if OSHA comes around and asks what's going on and why was this person climbing a rafter with no harness, you can say, look, that was on their own. They did that themselves. Here's the harnesses we provide. Here's the safety training. The person knew all about it. They signed off on it. Any sort of training you want, especially formal training, you want it to be acknowledged and acknowledged by the employee that they received it. You have to communicate safety procedures. So it's not just enough to just put the harness there and then say, go climb up the rafter. You need to tell them and show them how to wear that harness. If there's a procedure, it needs to be communicated. You need to keep the 300 logs and summaries. The 300 is the summary, and then the 300A are the logs at each work site. So you need to keep records of work-related injuries and illnesses, and we have to understand what those are exactly. And then no retaliating against employees for complaining about workplace safety or hazards, right? So OSHA has, like a lot of laws, OSHA has its own anti-retaliation provision. I will say the one thing I didn't put on here is you do need to inform employees by posting the Department of Labor OSHA agencies posters. So if you have the nice laminated 5-in-1 posters, then and those things are great. You should put those in your break room or wherever. And one of the required postings on that is with regard to OSHA and safety rules. So you definitely have to do some postings. Before I forget, one of the questions that we often get, or I often get, is what is the application of OSHA from a remote work situation? So a lot of employers, a lot of employees are moving toward, I think, more permanently, a greater percentage of our workforce is going to be working remotely. And so what is the obligation there? So you obviously have a lot of obligation with regard to the four corners of your property, right? So your property, your workplace, you have an affirmative obligation to create a safe work environment. Now you have that same obligation, though it is weaker, you have that same obligation with remote workers working from home. So, but you do not under OSHA, whereas with your physical workplace, you have to ensure the safety by reviewing and doing some observation, that sort of thing. But with remote workers, you do not. OSHA does not require that you go and physically inspect their work site, their home office or whatever it is, their kitchen table, wherever they're working, local coffee shop. You don't have to go and do that. You can take the person for their word. Now, what I would recommend, if you haven't been doing this and if you have remote workers, you should have a notification policy that those employees sign off on that says that they will let you know if anything is presented as a hazard in the workplace, if they feel like it's their workplace, their home office or whatever, is unsafe. And you want to make sure that they know that they can contact you about that, and then you could do something about it. For the most part, people don't live in unsafe homes, and so their work environment's probably fine. And, in retrospect, thankfully, the ergonomic rules didn't pass requiring ergonomic accommodations, like an ADA sort of accommodation. So the ergonomic rules didn't pass back in the 90s when they were vetoed. Otherwise, you might have an affirmative obligation to make sure that everybody at home, at their home office, has, really, ergonomic chairs and desks and stuff. But that didn't pass, and so we don't have that same sort of obligation. So it is weaker, and I do recommend that you get some sort of checklist from employees. Now, let's talk about a safety and health program, and I want to talk about the steps in identifying and assessing whether or not there's a hazard. And this is the sort of, your process, if you have a process, your process might look a little bit different. This is the process recommended by OSHA. So whether it's with regard to COVID or some other epidemic or pandemic or safety hazard, mold in the workplace, whatever it is, this is the sort of approach that the Department of Labor recommends and is kind of a best practice. Now, again, you might have added steps to this. You might talk about this differently. You might even, reorganize it. That's fine. But I want to give you a baseline understanding of how the government, recommends that we look at these things to assess and identify hazards in the workplace. And honestly, I think it's a pretty good approach. And it's really good for mitigation of, beside trying to not hurt people and present hazards and everything like that, we also are concerned about workplace, insurance premiums and risk of loss and all that thing, whether it's legal fees or litigation and payout on work comp and all the sorts of things. Anyway, fewer hazards. And fewer hazards is better for the workplace and the bottom line, I would say. So somebody asked if I have a checklist or policy you could use for home workers. And that's the sort of thing that we provide to clients. So you're welcome to contact us regarding that. So general steps. So the first thing we're going to do, and then we're going to talk about each of these individually. But so really briefly, I'm going to talk about that. So talk about the overview, but we're going to collect the information. So we're going to gather information, and then we're going to do periodic and assessments, inspections, and then we're going to specifically along the lines as just a best practice with HR or safety, whatever it is, we're going to talk about how we investigate illnesses, how we record illnesses, and then trying to understand and determine what the underlying issue is with the potential hazard, like what is causing, right? So if it's COVID, it's kind of obvious when somebody comes in and they're sick, and that's why so many employers have done the temperature checking, and now people are doing mandatory vaccinations, or they're encouraging vaccinations, and they're continuing to have masks, or they're doing partial masks, partial non-masks, depending on if you're vaccinated or not vaccinated. Just a lot of flows. But the whole reason you're doing this is because you have determined as an employer that COVID is an underlying, I don't want to say hazard, quote hazard, but it's an underlying condition that could have, that could harm people and could have people miss a lot of work. So you're, then taking action in response. The fourth step is to group similar incidents. So if we have a bunch of people that get COVID, I think we can probably, we're trying to go and figure out what the source is. COVID is a little bit different because it's in a narrow temporal band of when it occurs, as opposed to something like mold, which is probably ongoing in a building. But if you start to have a bunch of respiratory issues in one of your buildings, but not others, but people just start to have a bunch of respiratory issues and they're gone on FMLA and they're just having these sorts of signs. Again, you're starting to group these similar incidents. You might you might come to the conclusion that, hey, we need to have a building inspection done to see if there's mold around here, just by way of example. So we might want to group similar incidents to see if there's a trend. We also want to consider if there are hazards associated with emergency or non-routine situations, and then address those appropriately. And then determine the last thing we do is determine the severity and likelihood of the incidents for each hazard identified, and then prioritize our response. So if we have a lot of things going on, we might have to prioritize certain things. Okay, so let's go through these steps. But again, this is a recommended best practice process for identifying hazards. So again, step one, we're going to get information. So we're gathering information, and there's a lot of sources. This is not a full list of the sources that you might get information from, but you might get you might get information from the 300 logs. That's pretty obvious. Look at the history. You start to notice some trends going on. Work comp records, FMLA records is another one I had just mentioned a minute ago. Just general pattern recognition from managers or employees. If you've started to notice there's an uptick in the 300 logs or FMLA claims of kind of a similar nature. I want to start talking to employees about it. If they're all in like one department, maybe there's a issue with a machine in that department, or that department, the air filter or something like that's not working. If you feel like you need to bring an outside consultant to review a machine, or just, again, check the building to see if there's mold, you might have to do some job hazard analysis. You might also bring in a consultant to watch the employees. If the employees who are working on one machine or doing one process, if you continue to have some work comp injuries, you might want to bring an outside consultant, workplace consultant in. They're a type of engineer, and I can't process engineer anyway. So type of somebody who can assess and watch the job and determine if there's a better way to do it, a safer way to do it, and maybe identify like, hey, this tool, this machine, this process somehow is injuring people, and so we want to fix it so that stops. And again, similar to work comp records, insurance, and self-inspection reports that you might be conducting. These are all potential sources of information, but it really could come from anywhere where you're starting to get information, you're starting to get the sense that there might be a hazard in the workplace. And so then we're going to inspect it, right? So how are we going to do this? There's a lot of ways that we can inspect it, and it really depends on what we're looking for. But we should be doing general assessments and talking to people periodically, just to give, at a minimum, to get, routinely to get information from them about, how the process is going. Are they getting injured? Are they seeing any injuries? Are they seeing any hazards? This is the sort of thing that we want our managers to constantly be on the lookout for, and to be informing our safety people and HR if there's no specific safety director for the facility. So we might want to do some checklists that we prepare for them, again, based on the nature of your workplace. So the checklist to determine whether a law firm, a law office is safe is not going to be nearly as extensive as a manufacturing facility, right? There's just going to be not many options around a law firm, though you'd probably be surprised, boxes and stuff you could trip on, that sort of thing. I actually, a week ago, I opened our door, and after years, for whatever reason, the molding came off. And if it hadn't, I don't know how it didn't fall on my head, but this 7-foot long molding came off the door and then just kind of hung there, connected to the door. Anyway, law firms, super dangerous potentially. But even so, I guess if I had done a better job, I would not have been even looking at the molding on, above a door, but, as a potential hazard. But anyway, putting together checklists for a manufacturing facility or your office or whatever like that, it's just a good idea. It's good to just periodically walk through and see if there's anything, and just kind of talk to people to see if there's anything that they're seeing, just to make sure. This is all good safety precaution type of stuff. So I would use checklists for doing that. And these are some examples of items that you might put on a checklist. And obviously you would put on a checklist like for certain, I will now put on our safety checklist when I walk around the office, or have somebody else do it. I will put on there to check above the doors, to check the door molding where the doors are connected by, like a lever type thing, because obviously I don't want somebody, to have a 7-foot long molding thing fall on their head with nails sticking out of it and everything, which is almost what happened to me. So that is something we are now going to watch for at the Thompson Co. Minnesota office, and it's going to be added to the checklist. But you might have dozens of other checklist items that you might want to add to it, and it's just a good idea to do that and then to keep those records for several years. Identify hazards. And by the way, the checklist shows due diligence, so it's good for risk mitigation. It's not only good for risk mitigation, it also ensures that you look for everything. That's why we do checklists, right? To make sure we're doing everything. If you're assigning it to somebody else because you're on vacation or whatever, it's easy to give somebody else a checklist and be like, look at the door trim molding. Okay, check looked at it on May 20th, 2021. It looked pretty good. We obviously want to keep doing that. That's good for records. It shows it's really good for safety. It's good to ensure completedness, and also it's really good for showing that you're engaged in good safety practices from a risk mitigation standpoint. So number 3 is to identify the hazards themselves. And so there's, hazards, like I say here, come in a lot of different forms. There is no straight definition of what a hazard is. Like I think, a lot of us could probably spitball hazards, but really the hazards themselves, there's no like regulatory list of hazards where you just be like, okay, there's the flu, there's COVID, there's mold, it's kind of like similar to like the ADA, where yes, there's a definition of a disability, there's a definition of hazard, but I can't tell you what, like, that everything is a disability. Like, yes, cancer probably is a disability, but it's not guaranteed a disability, because it's not like there's a law that says cancer is 100% of the time a disability. Similar to hazards, which is why there's been a lot of waiting to understand whether COVID was going to be listed as a hazard, and it wasn't. OSHA didn't list it as a hazard, which meant OSHA really didn't have a lot of jurisdiction over COVID and the effects of COVID. So all these, so many of the, if not all of the OSHA complaints that were filed regarding COVID and unsafe workplaces because of COVID were pretty much dismissed. Now, there might have been a few OSHA, just for publicity here and there, that they might have processed because the employer was so negligent and with regard to their safety practices around COVID and probably related things. So they might have, I don't know. I heard of a couple that OSHA followed up on, but I think those were the real outliers. And my guess is 99.9% of OSHA claims regarding unsafe workplaces around COVID were likely dismissed because COVID, again, is not a safety hazard as defined under OSHA. So identifying the hazards. So these are ways that we might identify the hazard. So review product labels, identify exposure, excessive noise, determine whether the employees were exposed, sample the air. So we're trying to identify in that we're trying to figure out, like, what is the nature? Is this airborne? Is this chemical? Is this physical? What is the nature of the hazard itself? And then here are the 4 categories of how OSHA looks at hazards. So there's physical, biological, ergonomic, and chemical, and these are just examples. And this isn't a full list of the examples within each of these, but it gives you an idea of how OSHA categorizes them between these four categories, and gives you some examples of within each one. But again, you can see biological infectious diseases that would be potentially like COVID. Poisonous plants, animal materials, and again, very different, between an infectious disease and animal materials, but it's all a biological type of issue. And then here's the classic, OSHA understanding of the difference between hazard and risk, which I think is always nice to see. Okay, because who doesn't like sharks? I mean, I don't like sharks, but... And that shark's kind of scary, so I guess I really don't know. I would not want to meet that shark in person. And then we're going to move to conducting the incident investigation. So if something has occurred, there's been an accident, there's been an incident. It could be anything from something fairly minor to something, very tragic and big. And most of you have if you're in a manufacturing type of setting or with safety-sensitive positions, I'm sure you have a very detailed incident investigation protocol. Obviously, and you probably have lots and lots of training and safety directors and all that sort of thing. For those of you that don't have as full of teams that are engaged, because you might not have safety sensitive positions and you're just not, it's not a manufacturing type of situation. It might be more of an office environment. This still, this might be a little bit more newer for you, but this is how we would conduct investigations. So these are the sorts of tasks that we would do as part of an investigation. And that would be to develop a plan for the investigation itself. And you might have that already in place, but at the beginning, like when you get notified of an incident, you might have a knee-jerk way of immediately implementing the investigation, or you might have to talk about it and figure out, like, okay, who on our team is going to do this? Or are we going to bring somebody from outside? And it really is probably going to depend on the nature of the incident. You might also, in advance, if incidents occur, if incidents occur routinely, you might want to have a team trained in place. Obviously, manufacturing facilities, this is typical and a big deal, and you're going to do a lot of training, safety training, that sort of thing. So this is routine stuff in a manufacturing situation. Then you're going to conduct investigation with the trained team. They're going to know what to do because they're going to be trained in advance. And then you're going to investigate also close calls and near misses, in addition to just incidents. So it's not going to be just, our team is not going to just investigate the injuries, injuries that occur or situations that occur, but also, close calls and near misses as well. And we want to report those because we want to make sure that it doesn't happen again, obviously going forward. And then we want to figure out, again, to put a stop to it going forward, the root cause. And then we want to communicate the results so that some change can occur, so the close call or miss or incident never happens again. And this is the sort of risk mitigation protocol that you should be putting in place, whether it's an office environment or a manufacturing facility with safety-sensitive positions. Then we want to figure out, so once we see the incident or the close call, near miss, then we want to identify the hazards associated with the situation. And we want to, make sure and see if is this because of an emergency, or is this just a typical type of thing? And if it's an outlier situation like an emergency, we might have a very different response than if it's something that's very typical. If this has something to do with the equipment that's being used versus the process, then we might have to look at doing something different with the equipment, or shutting the equipment down, getting new equipment, that sort of analysis, versus a process where we might just put a stop to the process, change the process, inspect the building. If it's a building type of thing, you probably can't shut down a building, but maybe, if you inspect and you find that there's mold and it's to the level of an exposure that would violate OSHA, you shouldn't have people in the building. So you're going to have to move them elsewhere, shut down the building. If the mold, for example, is to the level of a hazard. But we want, again, there's a lot of examples of scenarios where the types of hazards themselves, where we identify what the hazard is. And workplace violence, I didn't mention this before, but workplace violence is an example of a hazard. Something that, if it's foreseeable, if it's a known safety risk or hazard, and it's workplace violence, it does fall within OSHA, and more importantly, it does give the employer an affirmative obligation to do something to remedy the situation and to create and to take away the unsafe nature of that, whether it's violence or a machine or a process or a building, I guess, or something else having to do with the job. Workplace violence is considered in that as well. And along those lines, if you've ever attended one of my harassment training seminars, webinars, that's how I talk about workplace harassment. Now, there's laws that say you can't harass in the workplace, but I always look at this from a general overview position that this is like OSHA, that OSHA requires that you have a safe workplace. And if you know about harassment, if you know about workplace violence, things that could cause physical harm to somebody, then under OSHA, you would have an obligation to remedy it, which is another reason why we shouldn't just shove under the rug potential, workplace harassment, hostile work environment, and violence also, whether it's, two coworkers fighting or somebody threatening another coworker, sexually or physically or both because of, who they are, what they are, that sort of thing. So then we want to characterize the nature. And again, we talked about this before, but we want to identify and we want to put it in the categories, right? So if like I mentioned before with like the mold building example, if you've got a bunch of people that seem, they just keep going on FMLA, there's a bunch of them that just keep going on FMLA with respiratory issues. We've had some work comp issues and everybody keeps hurting their right arm when they're using this one machine. We've had 3 of them out of like 7 people on the team. Well, you start to see the patterns and recognize those patterns. And once you do, then you start to identify it, and it'll help you with trying to understand what the underlying situation is so that you can prioritize and move on and try to fix it. Okay, there it is. So let's talk a little bit more about COVID and return to work, moving past our hazard assessment plan. Okay. I've been getting a lot of calls about COVID and return to work, especially since the CDC changed their rules like out of nowhere, which is great. I'm really glad they had some new research about spreading COVID if you're fully vaccinated. So that was great. And so a lot of us in the United States, not everywhere, because like a lot of states are still and cities still have mask ordinances in place, but a lot of us have no more mask mandate, which is great. And so then now the problem with that is that then it becomes the employer's choice, and it's sometimes hard to make that choice. It's easier if the government just tells you that you have to do something, like you have to wear the mask. Okay, well now you don't have to wear the mask in most of the United States. So what does that mean? Do you make people wear masks? Do you not make people wear masks? COVID's still out there. What about those people that aren't vaccinated? Are you going to make them wear masks? Because you know that if they come into the workplace, like they could get themselves sick, they could get others sick. So these are very difficult. There's no right answer here. Every workplace is different, but this is what it's like, right? I mean, the good news is you have flexibility. The bad news is you have flexibility in a lot of the United States. And one of the reasons you have flexibility is because it's your property. I've been saying that since pre-COVID. Your property, your rules. Obviously, you have the affirmative right obligation as an employer to ensure a safe work environment. But if you want to have, whether there's a pandemic or not, if you want to have all of the guests or all of the employees wear masks just because you like masks, you can do that. Obviously, you have to have exceptions for sincerely held religious beliefs or for a disability. But if the person has a disability, preventing them from safely wearing a mask. But other than those 2 things, you could make everybody wear masks. You could make customers wear masks. Not saying it's a great idea, but you definitely could if you wanted to, because it's your property. You have a lot of property rights. And so, the other thing to say is just know, I've been saying this since the beginning of the pandemic, the CDC issues guidelines. It's not, you're not legally required. Just because the CDC issues guidelines saying that, the new guidelines saying that it's okay to be indoors without a mask on around other people if you've been fully vaccinated. It's pretty safe. If you've not been fully vaccinated, then you should still be wearing a mask. So just because the CDC says that, that's great and all, but you don't have to follow it. The state of Minnesota immediately just pulled the whole mask mandate. And so now everybody except for people in Minneapolis, and employers in Minneapolis and certain employers in St. Paul, not all, just some employers in St. Paul, still have to follow the mask mandate, but the rest of the state can do whatever you want. You don't have to follow the mask mandate, but you do in other places around the country. So you should have a preparedness plan. Most employers, whether it's required by law, by executive order in your state or not, it's just a good idea. So you should have a preparedness plan. If you haven't returned to the workplace yet, definitely start with putting together a preparedness plan. And you want to communicate that to employees, and you want to make, because whether they've been vaccinated or not, a lot of employees, a lot of people in this country are still, and in the world, I guess, are still really, really concerned about their own health and their family's health, right? I mean, so many people have died from this that, you can't not be a little bit scarred and concerned about it. But for the most part, it sounds like the science says that if you've been vaccinated, you're pretty good. But you still want to have a preparedness plan to put people at ease. Same with communicating to employees, like what your plan is upon, what's your work from home plan going to be? What's your remote work plan going to be? Are you going to make everybody come back? When are you going to make them come back? Communication is really, really critical. It's critical from mainly it's critical from a cultural standpoint. I think there's some legal reasons to do the advanced communication, but for the most part, I think it's more of a human relations, cultural reason why we would want to communicate our preparedness plan and what stay at home, work from home looks like, and how you're going to transition, and what it's going to look like when you're back at the office. And somebody just asked how long we have to require the COVID preparedness plan in Minnesota. I don't have an answer for that. My understanding is that the COVID preparedness plan is still a requirement in Minnesota, and so I would just keep it updated. It's been required since I think June last year, though I don't quote me on that. But I don't believe that part has been rescinded. And generally, preparedness plans are recommended around the country, and the CDC recommends a preparedness plan as well. And those were the points on the preparedness plan that from that last slide. Okay, let's talk about OSHA reporting, because you do have to. So somebody else asked before I get into this, people who are vaccinated can still transmit COVID. So is there a best practice? And me, not a doctor, not an epidemiologist, but I believe the reason the CDC changed their position on masks in the workplace is because a new study came out and said that people who are fully vaccinated are not transmitting COVID, or are not as likely to transmit. Again, me, not a doctor, me, not an epidemiologist. You can go and check it for yourself. But my understanding is that's why they changed on a dime, because the study determined that people who are fully vaccinated are not transmitting COVID to non-vaccinated people. So I know there was some concern about that, but I think they kind of answered that question, which is why the federal government changed its position so quickly. But again, you might want to double check that for yourself to confirm. That's just my understanding. So the OSHA reporting forms, work-related injuries. So there are two types of forms, right? There's the 300A and there's the Form 300. The Form 300 has to be is the form that's going to report the specific injuries and illnesses themselves, and then the 300A is going to be your annual summary that you post for a few months every year. So yeah, a lot of HR people are pretty accustomed to filling out the Form 300. Now, hang on, I'm going to slide to the next. So there's the 300A log, and so yeah, as you can see, the 300A has not been changed since 2004. I thought I had that date right, so yeah, good for my memory, I guess. So yeah, these are the sorts of categories that we would put in, related injuries and illnesses that result in death, days away from work, restricted work, transfer of the job, medical treatment beyond first aid, loss of consciousness, significant injury or illness. So the medical treatment beyond first aid. So if somebody cuts their finger, minor cut on their finger, you don't have to report on the 300A log. With regard to COVID, you don't have to report You don't have to report it if somebody gets it, but you do have to report it if you're mandating the vaccine. So if you're mandating that employees get vaccinated, and if the vaccination itself, it like hurt my arm a little bit, but actually I was really lucky I didn't have any side effects from it. I would say a tiny bit lethargic the next day, but really not all that noticeable. But it did hurt my arm, both shots, and for a couple days. So that was kind of annoying. But if you're mandating the vaccine, and if the person has, meets one of those criteria where they have an illness, sustained illness from the vaccine, then you would need to report it. Then you would need to report it on your OSHA log. But otherwise, you don't really need to report COVID type of situations on your OSHA logs. If you want to, you can. It's no problem in over reporting at all. But for the most part, don't really have to do that. So, okay, let's talk. So OSHA has come out with some return to work guidance. And, like I mentioned before, our preparedness plan is recommended. It's required in some states as well if you're going to return to work. But these are the sorts of things. So even in a COVID type of environment, we had the whole assessment plan that we went through for a bunch of this webinar, the 6 steps. Well, it applies to this hazard assessment. It applies to COVID just like it would apply to mold or any sort of other potential hazard. I'm not saying that COVID is a hazard, but if you wanted to, it would be a really good process to just make sure that, which is a lot of you are doing, going through and just doing a hazard assessment, seeing how it is, addressing hygiene issues. And that's not to say that you need to, ensure that people, use deodorant or whatever before they come to work, though probably not a bad policy. But, hand washing availability, having bottles of, Purell around or whatever to clean, having masks available. Even if masks aren't required, even if they're and all that, I still think it's a good idea. Just like you might have, tissues around to use. I think it's still good for employers to have masks and like Purell and cleaning, good soap, antibiotic soap around, just to so that employees can, continue to, be safe and clean and that sort of thing. Social distancing, you don't have to continue to do the whole 6 feet distance thing, but is it still a bad idea to have higher walls around cubicles? Is it still a bad idea to distance people and have them sit apart? No, it's absolutely not. So these are the sorts of things that you might implement. But again, depending on where you are, you don't have to necessarily, but it's still, just because you don't have to doesn't mean it's not a bad practice. If you can socially distance your employees, identifying and isolating sick people, you might continue to have no travel policies. A lot of employers, and based on a lot of state rules, have said that employees who travel maybe to foreign countries or travel to like hotspots like Texas and Florida, where COVID has just been really bad. You might say like, hey, if you travel to those states, then you're going to have to quarantine. You're going to have to get a COVID test. That's still fair game. You could continue to have that as a policy if you wanted to. I think it's probably a little outdated now, personally, just because I think COVID is, I wouldn't say there's any real hot spots. I mean, you might have some local hot spots for sure, but for the most part, most of the COVID's on the downswing in the United States right now, and it's hard to say like, oh, if you travel to Florida versus traveling to North Carolina, it's hard to say that you're any more or less likely to pick up COVID along the way. But that doesn't mean that you can't have the policy. You definitely can have the policy for isolating sick people and making them quarantine for 10 days or 14 days, or getting a COVID test upon return before you bring them back to the workplace. And then just, workplace flexibility training, and then anti-retaliation. If somebody complains about, about safety issues, you just, it's not a good idea to fire them for it. So let me go through some questions that I get on a pretty much daily basis. And some of these are going to be pretty easy, and you've probably heard. And if you get our tips of the week, then you've probably read like all these sorts of answers, and you know all about this stuff. But just, since we're here in the webinar and we have a couple minutes, I'm going to go through them. So can employers conduct their own testing? Certainly they can conduct their own hazard testing, like, for mold or the machine, making the machine, or a process engineer or something like that. You can obviously do your own testing. You can do your own testing for COVID as well. So temperature testing has been a thing. I don't recommend doing COVID test. The COVID test itself, the saliva test, I don't recommend doing that. I don't think that's a good idea for employers to be doing that. I think that comes a little bit too close to being a medical exam, because the issue legally is whether it's a medical exam or not. And so I wouldn't do the saliva test, but doing a temperature check is pretty clear from the EOC that you can definitely do that. Can you mandate the vaccination? Yeah, you can mandate that all of your employees. Now, I wouldn't pick and choose employees. You don't want to walk into a discrimination claim, but can you mandate that your entire workforce gets vaccinated? Yeah, you could. You don't have to. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but you could if you wanted to. Can you request to see proof of vaccination? Are you going to have differential rules in the workplace for those people who are vaccinated versus those people who aren't vaccinated? If you're going to have differential rules, if it's important to know for whatever reason, for some sort of business or safety reason, whether somebody's been vaccinated, then yeah, go ahead and you can ask for proof of vaccination. It's not the government's determined that it's not a medical record. Whether, you get your little vaccination card, hopefully people hang on to those things, because I think for travel, especially international travel in the future, and maybe even going back to the workplace, I think showing vaccination is probably something that we're going to need to do in various circumstances. So, but as an employer, you can ask for proof of vaccination. I just wouldn't recommend it unless there's a purpose for it, unless that's going to drive some sort of other policy or decision that you're going to make. Are you going to have a policy that says, if we're having in-person meetings, we will say no masks if everybody's been vaccinated? But if not everybody's been vaccinated, if like one person's not been vaccinated, then we all have to wear masks, or at least that person has to wear a mask. You could have those sorts of policies, in which case asking for proof of the vaccination is a good idea. Can you conduct temperature checks and other health screenings? Yes, like I had mentioned before. When do you have to provide PPE? So anytime there's a known safety or health hazard that can be mitigated or completely handled by PPE, then you need to provide it. Then it's your affirmative obligation to provide it. Now, even if it's not a hazard, like COVID, if it's not a hazard, could you require PPE or face coverings? Yeah, you could. I mean, masks, again, forget the whole like whether the city or the state mandates it. Can you require face masks? Yeah, absolutely. You can require everybody wears them if you want. It's not PPE, so you don't have to provide it. I think it's a good idea to have some available, but you could just say, hey, look, if you want to come and work here, you put a mask on, and if you don't, then that's not a good idea. So and then if PPE is not available to reduce the safety risk and there's no alternative method, can you proceed? The answer is no. And I'd mentioned that before. Like if you've got to go climb the rafter and it requires a harness, and the harness is broken, and there's no alternative method to getting up on the rafter, can you still go forward and walk on that rafter? And the answer is no. So that you cannot. There's no exception to the OSHA requirement. Another question came in and said, is it okay for people to voluntarily submit if they've been vaccinated? Sure. They can voluntarily submit it, or you can mandate it, whichever you prefer. Time is up. 1 hour on the nose. I really appreciate everybody's attendance. You are welcome to reach out to me at any time. Our next webinar is going to be in a month from now, June 17th. and we're going to talk more extensively about working from home or returning, and all the, we're going to dive in deeper about those issues and stuff. And I think it's going to time pretty well as, July 1 rolls around, and we're talking about so many businesses planning to return to having their employees return to the office. So I appreciate your attendance. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me directly at kmosher@thompsonco.com or call at 651-389-5007. Otherwise, I hope you have a good month. Thank you.